Imagine you're at an international conference. Around the table are representatives of all the great powers of Europe: Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Soviet Union. You are all in agreement, non-intervention. Every last one of you has signed up to a deal, agreeing not to get involved in a civil conflict in Spain. You've all agreed not to participate or even allow the sale of weapons or supplies to either faction. Now imagine this committee sitting week after week as every day more and more reports confirm that 3 of the superpowers are defying the agreement. It becomes common knowledge, yet the agreement still remains in force, and the powers, save the Soviets, all stand by it. The German and Italian representatives examine the photographs and reports brought before the committee and deny what is right in front of them in black and white. And the other delegates don't even bat an eye. In fact, they recommend that Germany and Italy be given permission to police Spanish waters. Confused yet? This is just one inexplicable aspect of history's most complicated war.
Hello, and welcome to Episode 9 of History's Most Complicated War, Part 2, The War, the Conflict. This is the Spanish Civil War. My name is Peter. This is my co-host, Alex.
Hello there, yes. Well, first of all, if you haven't listened to Part 1 about why the Spanish Civil War is history's most complicated war, we would advise you to do that. In fact, we would advise you to go all the way back to Episode 6, because we are doing a 4-part series on 20th century Spain, culminating with this episode. This is the Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows of History's Most, the 2-part finale. And today we're looking at the Spanish Civil War, which is kind of, it's as a historian, it's kind of one of my real specialisms. So I am working very hard today to keep myself down.
Yeah, we try and keep it to an hour. Yeah. If we go a little bit over, I think it'll be fine. I don't think our listeners will mind that much.
I'm not going to complain.
But, we'll try and stay, a little restrained.
They might complain about the fact that we're going to mention my book for like the 3rd or 4th episode in a row, but we won't go into as much detail as I do in my new book, The People's Army in the Spanish Civil War, a fascinating blow-by-blow account of some of the key battles of the Spanish Civil War from the perspective of the Republican People's Army, which is one of the complicated and fascinating elements of the Spanish Civil War. We might get to touch on it a little bit today, but it's just going to be a teaser, I think. Talking of the book, I was interviewed by a lovely Chris Alvarez, who has a podcast called Military History Inside Out. He, the guest he had on before me, the episode before me, was Max Hastings. So I feel, in pretty esteemed company. It's a good podcast. I've listened to some really interesting episodes. There's an episode about mass murder in Renaissance warfare. Really. But yeah, if you go on Military History Inside Out's pod feed, wherever you get your podcasts, there's an interview with me. So if you want to hear more of me talking, and me talking specifically about the book and what it's about, and about the Spanish Civil War, more than if you're not satisfied at the end of this hour, then you can find that.
I'll put the link down in the description then for this episode.
Yeah. A little peek behind the podcasting curtain, by the way. I had plugged in all my equipment to speak to Chris, but he conducts his podcast's interviews. The interviews that he does are over Skype. We
use Discord.
Listeners, we use Discord. And so all my microphone is set up for Discord to read, but I had plugged in my microphone and headphones, opened up Skype, got on this call with Chris, and at the end, realised that on the Skype settings it was using my laptop's microphone.
Oh.
Not the sound equipment that I had. So the quality, I mean, obviously listening to History's Most, you're used to outstanding sound quality. So just to say, my voice, if it sounds weird, it's because it's over Skype.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think in one of the episodes, one of our earlier episodes, we did have a little bit of I think it was our first part of our naval voyage story.
Voyage.
Yeah, we had some issues there. So
teething podcast problems.
Yeah, I mean,
hopefully you're hearing us loud and clear now.
Yes, with any luck.
Oh, and one more thing. I have something else you could link, Peter. Would be I've written an article for a website called History Hit, which is kind of the Netflix of history.
All right.
That's how it sells itself anyway. But it's a pretty good website and service. And I've written an article for them entitled "Why Did the Republicans Lose the Spanish Civil War?" So, again, if you're desperate for more Spanish Civil War content, which I'm sure you are, because it is history's most complicated war, I'm sure that'll be linked as well.
Yes, it certainly will. So, let's just dive right in, shall we?
Let's get into it. Yeah, enough fuss.
The Spanish Civil War. Now, this is complicated. Well, I mean, that's what it's called, the history's most complicated war.
Yeah.
So where did we leave off from? So we left off with Francisco Franco beginning a grand coup against the Popular Front, the elected front
government
to the Spanish government. And what
happens next?
What happens next?
Yeah. Well, one of the complicated things about it is that Franco had only committed himself to the coup at a late stage, so he wasn't even recognised as the leader at the start. So we're going to delve into a few of the complicated aspects that make the Spanish Civil War so fascinating, so intricate. I think the phrase used last time, so many moving parts to it. But let's first of all do a very brief overview, because I think we decided the narrative approach we usually take wouldn't work with this episode because I would speak for too long. So very briefly, the war breaks out in July of 1936, leading directly from last episode. And it's a military coup staged by a large section of the army, mainly the Africanista officers, against the government of the Spanish Republic. It succeeds in some cities, some of the southern cities, and much of northern Spain, particularly rural north. But it fails. The coup fails in a large swathe of the country, and not so much because the Republican government, is strong or acts swiftly, but what they do is in the first couple of days of the war they arm workers and peasant militias that have been spontaneously formed by left-wing unions, left-wing political groups who want to defend the Republic. And they're armed, they're supported by some loyal police force, security forces, that sort of thing. And they succeed in most of the big cities in Spain: Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Bilbao. They succeed in defeating the army's coup, the uprising. However, the failure of the coup means that Spain's basically split into a zone controlled by the military rebels and a zone controlled by the Republican government. Well, controlled in inverted commas. We'll come to that as well, because that is complicated. So you've got two factions. You have got the military rebels, also known as variously insurgents, Francoists, fascists, or nationalists is what they call themselves, although the term kind of doesn't translate that well into English. But anyway, so there's a complicated element already. One of the sides has 5 names. And on the other hand, you have the Republicans or Loyalists or Reds. And broadly speaking, it's an ideological war of left v right. Supporting the Republic, you have parties and politicians and people from the kind of centrist liberals and centre-left, Bethania, through to communists and anarchists on the far left. And the rebels are obviously conservative right-wing, Spain, the Falange, the fascist party, the Carlists, the ultra-Catholic traditionalists, the Catholic Church itself. So Spain is split along ideological lines. Very briefly, I'll go through the course of the war. So at the start, the professional army of the rebels does very well against the amateur militia of the Republicans, and they advance across southern Spain up to the autumn of 1936, where they get halted at Madrid. They try in the winter of 36 to take Madrid, to storm it, to besiege it, to surround it various times, but they failed as Franco's forces. Then Franco switches his emphasis to the north, where there's a small region of the Basque Country, of Asturias, of Santander that is pro-Republic, but is surrounded on all sides by nationalist area. And from March to October, they slowly crush and destroy that northern zone, which brings a huge amount of industry into Franco's control. In the meantime, the Republic in 1937 tries to launch a few offensives to distract Franco from his northern objective, which generally, unfortunately, don't succeed. That's kind of one of the main topics I deal with in my book, these kind of battles. And then you get, with the Republicans basically worn out from their failures, the following spring of 38, Franco launches a huge offensive in Aragon, in northeastern Spain, punches through the Republic all the way through to the Mediterranean coast, so splits the Republic in two. You have a main bit of central and southern Spain, and then you have Catalonia cut off in the northeast. Franco pushes towards Valencia, but before he can get there, the Republicans launch another distraction kind of offensive on the Ebro, which Franco turns, faces, halts, and slowly defeats and takes back the territory he'd lost in Catalonia. In the winter of 38-39, he storms Catalonia, captures Barcelona, and this leaves the kind of a rump of about 30% of Spain, including Madrid and Valencia, in Republican hands, but it's clear that the war is lost. And what's left of the Republic ends up kind of fighting itself. And Franco moves in, and in April 1939, 1st of April, April Fool's Day, he declares victory.
Right.
So there you go, simple.
So that's a really, really quick overview to the Spanish Civil War. Breakneck speed. But we're going to dive into a few of the things, the specific little things, mainly the driving forces, the ideological side of things, the political side, and we're also going to talk a little bit about the international brigades and the kind of international involvement. Because that's one of the most interesting parts to me. Definitely, for sure. Is the foreign involvement.
So should we start with foreign intervention?
Sure.
Okay. I think that's one way that the Spanish Civil War is best kind of remembered and thought about, at least outside of Spain, is the fact that foreign powers get involved. Famously, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin are the kind of big leaders who get themselves involved in the Spanish Civil War. How and why, I guess, is what we should think about, and why does this add layers of complexity? At the start of the outbreak of war, the Republicans had appealed to primarily France, which is obviously next door and politically was fairly sympathetic to the Republic. there wasn't even a Russian ambassador in Spain before the war. There wasn't even a Russian to Spanish, I believe, dictionary in print. So relationship between Spain and Soviet Union before the Spanish Civil War, it was kind of non-existent. Now, what happens is France is tempted to help the Republicans, but Britain, which is France's primary ally at that time, is definitely not interested. There's a predominantly conservative government in Britain, and they're not particularly interested in the cause of the Spanish Republic. And primarily their concern is to prevent a wider European war developing. So they don't want other countries getting involved. And so the British and French decide the best thing would be non-intervention, would be that the countries of, the major powers don't get involved. Let's keep tensions in Europe low. Let's avoid this escalating into a world war scenario. And let's restrict any arms or supplies getting into Spain to stop this spiraling into a bigger conflict. So they put together in August 36, the war breaks out in July, they put together in August a non-intervention agreement that's going to be policed by a non-intervention committee in London. And all the major powers, including the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, sign up and say, we are not going to get involved in Spain. This civil war is going to maintain as an internal thing, and we're not going to sell anything, we're not going to trade anything that could be used in the conflict. So you might think, there we go.
Yeah.
No foreign intervention.
None at all. Absolutely none. Well, let's not be so hasty.
Indeed. Because, of course, you've got a few characters that I outlined just a second ago who aren't always known for abiding by international agreements.
Yeah.
So in July 1936, before any of that had happened, General Franco finds himself in Morocco with his top elite Africanista troops, the Spanish Foreign Legion and what were called the Regulares, Moroccan mercenaries. But they're trapped. They're trapped in Morocco because the Spanish Navy has supported the Republic. So they have no way of getting to Spain to fight in the Civil War. The best troops and the best general of the Spanish army. So within a few days of the war starting, Franco sends off a couple of representatives, one to Nazi Germany and one to Fascist Italy, to request aid. Primarily, he's there requesting aircraft. He wants planes to take his troops across the Straits of Gibraltar from Morocco into Spain. And before the war is even a fortnight old, there are Nazi and Italian aircraft in Morocco have arrived and are there taking the troops over.
Yeah.
And Hitler took this decision during a Wagner festival that he was attending, and he took it in a kind of in a spontaneous kind of ideological sympathy for Franco's cause, and said, yes, we'll send help. On the other hand, Mussolini was more looking at it from a strategic point of view. He was concerned with the Mediterranean, that he wanted to control the Mediterranean Sea, and he thought, if we can get Spain as an ally, that will really help our cause. It'll make Britain's position difficult, for example, on Gibraltar. And he possibly hoped he might get some of the Spanish Balearic Islands, or at least get bases on them anyway. Ironically, actually, as the war goes on, Mussolini using his head, Hitler using his heart to support Franco, it kind of switches round, because strategically it actually does a lot of harm to Italy, because they basically spend so much money, use so much resources in Spain. And it's more like he basically becomes ideologically committed to this crusade against what they would say is Bolshevism in Spain. On the other hand, the Nazis begin to fairly cleverly use Spain as an economic resource and keep attaching to their aid. Well, we'll give you this if you give us rights over your mineral resources and if you give us these things. And they basically, having made a spontaneous ideological decision, switched to a much more hard-nosed economic perspective of, right, Germany needs these resources, such as pyrites, which were used in tank armor, and Spain has them, so we're going to use this position to get as much as we can. But the foreign intervention by Italy and Germany was pretty blatant, defying that agreement, and yet the committee didn't really do anything about it. They sent, the Italians in total sent about 80,000 personnel and 600 aircraft, plus a ton of other equipment, firearms, artillery, and basically was in a situation where they were at war with the Spanish Republic because they made up the majority of Franco's air force. They had a corps called the CTV of, at its peak, about 50,000 men just literally fighting on the ground. So the support Mussolini provided to Franco was unmatched, really, in terms of quantity by any other power. On the other hand, the Germans, it was all about quality. The Germans, it's quite famous, their Condor Legion that went to Spain was kind of, people say, like a testing ground for like the Luftwaffe and for the techniques that would be used in the Second World War.
I believe the Stuka was first used in the Spanish Civil War, actually.
Absolutely, the Stuka dive bomber, the Messerschmitt 109 fighter plane, the Heinkel HE-111 bomber. A lot of the things that would be familiar, become familiar, become iconic, become infamous, if you like, in the Second World War, get their combat trials in Spain, and pilots and air crews get, again, their first experiences of combat in Spain, and it's really essential for the Luftwaffe, building up that kind of strategies and tactics and close air support. And they do succeed, really. They, from mid-1937 onwards, they win air superiority and don't really lose it for the duration of the war. There's nothing the Republic has that can match, say, the 109 fighter. So the Nazi involvement is smaller. They send less. There's probably no more than 5,000 Condor Legion personnel in Spain at any one time, which also includes, by the way, ground units, but no one fighting directly on the front lines. More like artillery and tanks support. They're not providing like foot soldiers like the Italians were. But like I say, it's quality, quantity kind of thing. Yeah. And Franco's lucky because he gets quality from one and quantity from the other.
Well, I was going to ask, what kind of... I mean, I know you said that there's nothing that compares, but did the Republic have anything in terms of aircraft, really, that was able to,
Yeah. Comparable, yeah. So the Republic, on the other hand, because it was the legitimate government of Spain, it had Spain's gold reserves. It would have liked to have just gone out and bought military equipment. But it couldn't because the non-intervention agreement barred them from buying stuff on the international market. So they had to rely on the black market, which they got ripped off and really just didn't get anything of value from. And they had to rely on Stalin and the Soviet Union. They transferred their gold to Moscow to use almost like a current account to buy stuff from. And Stalin did provide some things like the I-16 fighter was, until the German 109 arrived, the best plane in Spain. The T-26 tank and the BT-5 tank that the Soviets provided to the Republic were the best tanks in Spain, definitely better than the Panzer I and the ridiculous CV-33 tankette that the Italians sent, which was a silly little two-man, smaller than a car.
Yeah, I think I've seen pictures of it.
It's with machine guns and paper-thin armour. But as well as the good stuff, unfortunately, Stalin took the opportunity to offload a huge amount of just unwanted and useless equipment or antiquated, obsolete equipment that the Soviet Union had lying around from the Russo-Japanese War. maybe some of Rosabetsky's stuff. No, but just stuff from the 19th century, stuff from the Russo-Japanese War, stuff from the First World War, things that had been in storage for decades and didn't work, equipment without sights, without spare parts, without instructions, but also the variety. I mean, they sent captured Japanese weapons from the Russo-Japanese War on the black market. Obviously, the Republic bought from wherever it could get it. First World War equipment from various nations, because the Tsar's Russia had been given stuff by the Allies, so by the French, by the British, by the Americans. So,
I've often, within like firearm circles, you hear people say, "Oh, what guns were used in the Spanish Civil War?" And the response that invariably you get is, all of them, everything.
Pretty much every gun from the late 19th and early 20th century.
You get Arisakas in Spain.
Yeah.
And it's like.
But the problem is how much ammunition would be coming.
Oh yeah, exactly.
And would you be able to buy more? No. So it's an absolute nightmare for the Republic. Whereas Italy and Germany send Franco Italian and German weapons, which they can then buy, more of, or ammunition for, whatever. As I said, the Soviet Union is basically emptying out its stocks on the Republic, charging them a lot in the meantime, and they get just too much variety. It's a logistical nightmare. They have something like 50 different types of rifles used in the Republican Army.
Yeah.
I mean, most armies will have 1, 2, or 3. It's just near on impossible because each one is going to be different, maintained in a different way, use a different caliber of ammunition. How do you know which ammunition needs to go to which unit? So, although the Republicans managed to get some quality equipment from the Soviet Union, and the Soviets do send a couple of thousand advisors over the course of the war to help the Republic, they don't send, ground troops. And like I said, Stalin isn't quite so generous.
Yeah.
And also from late 1937 onwards begins to lose interest and the supplies really begin to dry up. So, the contrast is kind of clear. One of the Soviets storm out of the non-intervention committee because of the violations by, Germany and Italy. But, this is the era of appeasement, so I guess you can't expect the West to have done anything about it. But one of the ridiculous things the non-intervention agreement does is they say, well, to be most fair and balanced, the British and French navies are going to police the nationalist coastline and try and stop any supplies getting in. And the German and Italian navies can police the Republican coastline.
Oh, that's fair. That's very fair. That's insane.
I know, that's all in the name of fairness. But at one point they end up shelling a Spanish town as a German warship. So you can see how that went. And the Italians conduct what amounts basically to piracy in the Mediterranean, sinking ships that are coming towards the Republic. Particularly in the summer of 1937, they are sinking a lot of shipping on its way to the Republic. And the Republic ends up short not just on weapons, but just on food in general. There's terrible shortages in the Republic as a result of this blockade that they put under. I guess we should briefly mention as well why the Soviets got involved in Spain. Because we said why Hitler and Mussolini did. Now, there's obviously an ideological element.
Yeah.
They're politically quite sympathetic, but then the Republic wasn't a communist state. And some people in the Cold War kind of assumed, because of course the Soviet Union in the Cold War was trying to take over other countries and install communism, that would have been happening in the 30s too. But on the other hand, the Soviet Union never installed a kind of puppet state where it didn't have the Red Army in it, basically, to put it frankly, which wasn't in Spain. And in the 30s, the Soviet Union wasn't quite the world power. Well, it certainly wasn't the world power it would be in the Cold War. And it probably didn't have the power projection capabilities to just install a regime of their choosing in a foreign land, particularly one so far away. So in reality, if you look at the kind of diplomatic documents going around at the time in 1936, the primary concern of Stalin was to stop Franco winning in Spain, because his only allies, Russia was a pariah state, you've got to remember at this time, his only ally of sorts was France, who he had a collective security agreement with. And he knew there was going to be, or he very much thought there was going to be a future war against Hitler's Germany. And he basically needed an alliance with the French, and preferably the British as well, he thought, to stop that happening. And he thought if Franco wins in Spain, aided by Hitler and Mussolini, France is going to be surrounded on three sides.
Right.
They're going to have Spain to the southwest, Italy to the southeast, Germany to the east. They're not going to be able to help us out at all. So the British ambassador to Moscow actually said in the summer of 36, for the Russians, Spain is all about the security of France. And Stalin, often he would, I think, would subordinate ideology to realpolitik. For example, the Nazi-Soviet pact, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's prepared to do whatever it takes to maintain his power and the Soviet Union's power. And really, I think this Spain is another case of that. And I think he was probably surprised by the fact that Britain and France didn't help the Republic, even though it might have been in their interests when you think about Spain's southern border, France's southern border, or Gibraltar, for example.
Yeah.
But there we are.
Now, I know that the International Brigades are another example of foreign involvement, and those were set up by Communist International, which was Comintern, which was the Soviet Union's kind of attempt to export global communism.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were... I'm not sure about the structure of the International Brigades. I don't really know a lot about how they were actually structured. What was the involvement with the Soviet Union specifically for that? Like, how disconnected was all that?
Yeah, good question. The International Brigades were made up of about 32,000 volunteers from around the world who came to fight for the Spanish Republic. It was organized, as you say, and funded, crucially, by the Comintern, the Communist International, based in Moscow. And certainly, probably to begin with, there was an element of this was kind of almost like a propaganda kind of thing.
Yeah. It was ideological, I think.
Yeah,
for a lot
demonstrating international solidarity with the Republic, showing what kind of the left could do. And certainly the majority of International Brigaders were communists. One of the things that's complicated about the International Brigades, I think, is the fact that the two most famous members, at least in the kind of English-speaking world, George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway, neither of them were members of the International Brigades.
Yeah.
And yet, when people say International Brigades, I think most commonly people think, oh yeah, Orwell went to fight in Spain, Hemingway went to fight in Spain.
Yeah.
Well, Orwell went to fight in a militia that was not part of the International Brigades, which we might talk about a bit later. And Hemingway went as a journalist and didn't do any fighting. So there's a lot of myths around the International Brigades, I think. To kind of go more to your question, they were created in the September, I think formally in September 1936, the Comintern decided to do this. Volunteers had been going to Spain already, spontaneously, in the first few months of the war. And it was kind of an attempt to organize that. And the Comintern involvement was that they recruited in each nation through the local Communist Party. So, for example, in Britain, you had to go to Communist Party headquarters in London, be interviewed and kind of screened. And as I say, about figures vary and it's different from nation to nation, but 50 to 70% of volunteers were Communist Party members. What happened then is the Communist Party would organise your trip to... They would just transport you to France. They would buy you a ticket to get to Paris. Often it was illegal to volunteer in a foreign army. In Britain it was, in America it was. So you had to kind of go on almost like a tourist ticket to Paris. The Comintern had then set up in Paris like a kind of centre where you'd be given a health check, gathered up. They would kind of every kind of wait a week maybe for groups to arrive from different countries. And then they'd take you down by train to the southern France, to the border with Spain, the Pyrenees, bus you over to the mountains, the Pyrenees Mountains, the actual border, and then at night, guides would kind of lead them across the border because of non-intervention. It was illegal, so they had to go at night under the cover of darkness, sneaking past kind of border guards. And then once in Spain, the Comintern kind of had set up and ran the infrastructure of the International Brigade. They set up a base in a town called Albacete. They provided, like I say, the funding. They tried to get together the uniforms and equipment from Soviet aid. And they provided a lot of the personnel of the upper ranks of the brigades were Comintern personnel. So you would have had someone like André Marty was the formal head of the brigades from the Comintern of French communists. The real organisation was done by a guy called Luigi Longo, an Italian communist from the Comintern. And then the military leadership was at first under a series of actually Red Army officers dispatched by the Soviet Union, who were, by the way, incidentally foreigners in the Red Army, to make it look like it wasn't the Russians doing it. So you had people like, they fought under pseudonyms, so General Kleber, who was he was from old Austria-Hungary, General Walter, who was a Pole, a guy who called himself General Gomez, who was a German. But yeah, various communists kind of made up the top ranks of the International Brigades, and it was mainly kind of organised and directed from Moscow. So it is complicated as well because people say it's a kind of communist army, Comintern army, and yes, to a large extent, from what I said, it's true. On the other hand, a lot of the volunteers weren't communists, and it wasn't like they were, in any case, really forced to go. They were genuinely volunteers, ideological volunteers. They hadn't been, conscripted or anything. So the history of the International Brigades is kind of very complex, and there's this idea as well that they were all poets and intellectuals and writers, but probably about 80% of them at least were working class, which isn't really surprising when you think mostly communists and left-wing activists. So these were, members of left political parties, unions, they mostly people who worked in, obviously, things like mining, shipbuilding, heavy industry, that sort of thing. So I probably think it's probably worthy of its own episode. I reckon one day.
International
Brigades justice.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, especially in America, I would say that there's a vision kind of cemented of the International Brigades. Mainly by folk singers, mainly by people like Woody Guthrie, Joan Baez, and Pete Seeger, things like that. I mean, they did a lot of songs about the Spanish Civil War, and I think for us, at least, that kind of vision has been, cemented in that. And like you say, people have this idea that a lot of them were writers and singers and intellectuals and things, and I
mean, there certainly were.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But when I say that, I don't mean to in any way take away from.
Oh yeah, no.
There's nothing wrong with being a working class activist. In fact, it's kind of impressive. I think that they went to Spain, but. It's a layer of complexity to this war that actually the traditional narrative of people who, I think most people don't know very much at all about the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah.
And then the people who know a little bit, like entry-level knowledge, will have that vision of the International Brigades as the kind of intellectuals, and then the George Orwells. And then there's another layer of complexity under that where actually kind of there's a lot of myth there, and it's really much more complex a picture than that.
Yeah. Which is why we're covering it.
Indeed, which is why it's history's most complicated war.
So, what other things were we going to dive into here?
What else is complicated?
Everything.
Yeah. The politics. Should we talk a bit about the politics of the war?
Yeah.
That's pretty complicated. So obviously there's two sides, and each side has its own political goings-on.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with the Francoists, the rebels. Now, the complicated thing here is that the leader of the military rebellion dies at the start of the war. He is General Sanjurjo, who we mentioned last time during the story of the Republic in Part 1. And he was in exile in Portugal, and he was the senior Africanista general, so he was recognized as the leader of the coup.
Right.
He's in exile in Portugal. A plane goes to pick him up. It's just a little two-man biplane. He fills it up with luggage, too much luggage. As it tries to take off, it's too heavy, crashes, he dies.
Oh.
Proper history's most stuff there. You can, if at home you've got your bingo cards, cross off comedic death for this episode.
Maybe that should just be the free space.
So then you've got a leadership problem. Now, it passes because they're military men. It passes to the next most senior officer, a guy called General Cabanelas. But he is not really, he's not leadership material. The other leading figure is the self-appointed director of the coup, General Mola, who again I mentioned quite a lot last time. And he kind of takes control of northern Spain, or the northern half of the nationalist zone, the rebel area they've taken control of. But then there is Franco. Now, Franco is both probably one of the most kind of well-respected generals at the time, and he's very shrewd politically. He's cunning. Because what he does is, from the very start of the conflict, when you recall from a little bit before, he sent representatives out to Hitler and Mussolini.
Mm-hmm.
And he sent them out saying he was the leader of the rebels, even though he wasn't, and he had no official claim to be. He basically portrayed himself as head of the rebellion, head of the nationalist government. He created his own press and propaganda team, which none of the other generals did because they were generals fighting a civil war. Hadn't really thought of this aspect of it. And so through the summer of 1936, Franco begins to portray himself like he's the leader. And he is the one who enjoys the most military success at the start of the war as well, which obviously helps his cause. And then in September of 1936, at a conference of the top generals, he basically demands that they put him in charge. They appoint him as the generalissimo, the military overall commander, and the kind of leader of the rebels. And they reluctantly, the generals kind of go along with it. But they probably more imagined him as being the first among equals kind of figure. But the complete opposite happens, because when Franco's team comes out with the press statement, they basically say he is head of state, head of the government, and military commander-in-chief. And it's a fait accompli. The other generals haven't agreed to all this, but he's done it. He's said it. And so they have to go along with it. So he basically gets control over the military, gets himself made head of state, which is a position he'll keep for the rest of his life until 1975. But then there's the political factions. I mentioned the Falange, the fascist party. I mentioned the Carlists.
Yeah.
There's Theda, of course, the big right-wing movement. And now they're all supportive of Franco's coup, but are they going to necessarily just fall into line and accept his political authority? Not necessarily. So what he does is he makes it very clear to Gil Robles that he's not welcome in Spain. He falls out with the leader of the Carlists, a guy called Falconde, over military control over the Carlist militias. Franco saying they've got to become part of the Spanish military. Falconde wants to keep independent control over his Carlists. The dispute ends with Falconde going into exile. Now, the interesting one is the Falange, the fascist party. Now, obviously, the Nazis, and to some extent the Italians, are quite keen on the Falange, the Spanish fascist party.
Yeah, understandably so.
And in the winter of 36-7, in fact, I think Germany even sends over some technical experts to run like an officer training school for the Falange militia, separate to the Spanish military. So obviously, again, Franco sees this as a threat to his power. Now, luckily for him, the charismatic leader of the Falange, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, who got a name drop last time,
Yep.
General Primo's son, the leader of the fascists. Luckily for Franco, he'd been arrested before the Civil War started. Jose Antonio had gone to prison because of the terrorist activities of the Falange that we talked about before.
Right.
Before the Civil War. So when the war started, he was in a prison. He was in a Republican prison, and he remained there. And in fact, the Republicans executed him in November of 1936. The trouble is, the Republicans never publicly said, we've executed him, because it would look bad, obviously. So the Falange, the fascist party, is in a position of popularity and is having Nazi support, but they don't have a leader. And they don't know if their leader's dead. There's rumours that he might be dead, but Franco, rather cleverly, rather shrewdly, denies the rumours. Says, no, there's no proof he's dead. There's even evidence that a Nazi secret plan to try and break Jose Antonio out of prison, he deliberately obstructed it and stopped it happening. And what happens is the Falange is terribly split between people who still support Jose Antonio as the leader, even though he's dead, but they're not sure he's dead, which is mainly his relatives, and between the new leader, a man called Manuel Hedilla, who Paul Preston describes as an unsophisticated fascist thug, who wants to be the new leader. And so what Franco's brother-in-law, a guy called Serrano Suner, who's his kind of main political kind of behind-the-scenes guy, they basically come up with a plot to unify all the right-wing parties under Franco's leadership and to play on this Falange split. So the split between the Hedilla faction and the Jose Antonio faction eventually comes to blows in April of 37, not least because of Serrano Suner and Franco's kind of meddling in both factions and kind of playing them off against each other. And then they pounce on that outbreak of violence to issue a decree unifying all parties in Franco's Spain, the rebel zone, into one. It's got a ridiculous name. It's basically, you can kind of just call it the Falange, or Franco often calls it the Movimiento, the movement. But it's a merger of the Falange. The Fed has basically disappeared at this point, but primarily the Falange and the Carlists. Now, Hedilla had been promised to be the kind of head of this new unified party. So he'd gone along with it. He'd said, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Unify all the parties because I'll be at the head of it. And he'd been promised to be at the head of it. But Franco and Serrano Suner do another little fait accompli. When they make the announcement, Franco's the head of it, and and Hedilla is just named as one of the members of the kind of general council of the party.
I bet he wasn't
not even
thrilled
with a
about
special
that.
position or anything, just one of the members of its kind of governing body, which otherwise is filled up with yes men.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's absolutely not happy about it. He basically orders Falange party branches to follow his orders and not Franco's. So he gets arrested and sentenced to death.
Oh. Oh, right. Okay.
He's never actually executed, but that's pretty much the end of any political dissent in Franco's Spain. And like I say, it's complicated, isn't it? It's a kind of internal fight between different far-right groups that ends with just Franco.
Just
Franco's head of the state.
All
Franco's
roads.
head of the government. Franco's head of the party.
Yeah. All roads lead to Franco.
Which is funny because I know we're not talking that much about him personally, but he was quite a short man, diminutive character with quite a squeaky, high-pitched voice. Apparently, he wasn't a charismatic Mussolini or Hitler by any means.
Yeah,
but what he did have was military power and prestige from victories, and as I say, a convincing propaganda kind of operation that portrayed him as the savior and the one that could get it done.
What was the Republican political side like? Because I mean, I can imagine that's almost as messy, possibly even more.
Yeah, more complicated, I would say. Before we just delve into that, I just want to read you the official name of Franco's unified party, and you can probably see why he simplified it down to the movement.
Yeah.
Because it was called formerly the Falange Española Tradicionalista y de las Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista.
You know what? I'm not even going to. I mean, I probably could translate it if I wanted, but I mean that's so long.
The traditionalist Spanish phalanx and of the councils of the National Syndicalist Offensive.
Okay.
Even the acronym is FET y de las Huns.
Well,
so you just say the movement.
Yeah, the movement. That's just better. I mean, simpler.
So yeah, complicated. Anyway, the Republicans more complicated. As you remember from last episode, the government was just the left Republican groups, the kind of centre-left liberals, because Largo Caballero and his socialists had refused to take part in the government. Now that continues for the first few months of the war, but the first few months of the war go so badly for the Republic that everyone realises that they need, like all the parties of the Popular Front, need to come together. So in September 1936, Largo Caballero himself becomes Prime Minister. And he chairs a coalition government of the different parties of the Popular Front, the Left Republicans, the Socialists, the Communists, even the anarchists actually end up joining the government, which goes against all their beliefs and causes a massive philosophical war within the anarchist movement. But we'll not even get into that. Now, Largo Caballero's government it achieves some things, because what happened when the war started was, I said, part of Spain was left in the control of the Republic, of the government. Well, control in inverted commas, because they've armed a whole load of radical workers and peasant militias in order to stop the military uprising, right? But now what do you do? Because the army doesn't exist, basically, if you're the Republican government, because the army's now on the other side. The security force is largely the same thing. And you've got thousands, hundreds of thousands of armed militiamen roving about your territory. And you've got no way of controlling them. You can't tell them what to do because they've got guns. And there's no forces of law and order now to stop them. So the story of Caballero's government is a desperate attempt to rein in the kind of revolution that had happened accidentally when the Spanish Civil War broke out, because these militias, often formed by communists or socialists, whoever, once they had defeated the coup in their particular town, village or city, what did they do? Well, they used their newfound power to create the revolution they'd always dreamed of. They took over worker control or collectivized whether it be the land in a village, whether it be the workplace in a factory, whether it be the Ritz Hotel, they all came under worker control. So, although the Franco's coup had been launched to supposedly stop a revolution, it actually unleashed a genuine grassroots revolution over which the government had no control. So the mission of Largo Caballero's government and subsequent governments of the Republic was ironically a counter-revolutionary mission of reining in these radicals and undoing a lot of the revolutionary stuff that they did. I mean, one of the things that George Orwell's account of the war is when he arrives in Spain, he says, wow, it's amazing. No one wears ties, the workers control everything. And he said, by the time I left, it was all back to normal. And he obviously, as a socialist, kind of really regretted that fact. But the government's perspective was, hang on, we're trying to fight a civil war against Franco and the rebels. We need international support to win it. We can't fight a war and we can't gain international support if we're going to try and carry out a revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's so messy. It's
super messy.
I mean,
in some localities they get rid of money. They, it's really chaotic because it's in localities. It's not like there's one revolutionary party. There's not a Bolshevik party that takes power and says, right, we're collectivizing this, we're doing that. It's grassroots. It's genuinely from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Of a group of workers here will take control of this. A group of peasants there will collectivize all the land on their farms, whatever.
And
so there's no central control or direction, and the government finds it so difficult to do anything because of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all well and good, that these grassroots revolutions, until you remember there's a civil war going on, and if the Francoists win, then all of this will be
all
gone.
This dreams will be over.
It'll be.
So the primary political debate in the Republic was war versus revolution. Should it be the priority as the revolution, because this is our unique opportunity to carry through a genuine revolution, or should our priority be fighting Franco, fighting a war for which we need central government authority, for which we need basically to bring back quite a few aspects of capitalism, to kind of properly kind of organize things, for which we need the state to regain control over the Republican territory. Now, one of the things that that's a huge task, and Largo Caballero, really, to be frank, isn't up to it. He's a man in his late 60s, a trade unionist all his life, and he doesn't shake off his union roots and his union mindset, because he was asked why he hasn't got the workers of his trade union, the Socialist Trade Union, to start digging trenches to defend Madrid in the autumn of 36 when Franco was closing in. And he said, well, if I order them to do that, at the time they were still working on whatever they'd been doing before. They were building houses as if there wasn't anything happening. And Caballero's response was, if I order them to start digging trenches and stop their work, well, they might all just go and join the CNT, the anarchist union.
I mean, I guess
you're prime minister of a wartime.
Yeah,
there is bigger fish to fry. The American journalist Louis Fisher was kind of talking to him in that time period, that kind of desperate, the kind of late 1936, when things were going really wrong for the Republic, and he was listing all these problems, all these things the government isn't doing and needs to do. And the foreign minister, who could speak English because Caballero couldn't, who was doing the translating, kicked Louis Fisher under the table and said to him in English, "You're being too negative, he's going to get upset. Can you say some nice things now?"
Okay.
So yeah, Caballero was quite kind of... He was labelled the Spanish Lenin, but really he was not Lenin.
Yeah,
he was not a strong leader. He was not a... and ironically, he was working to rein in revolution rather than spread it. And so things come to a head in this debate of war v revolution in May 1937. It's an event called the May Days, which is another level of complexity because it's a civil war within the civil war. Basically, in Barcelona, one of the collectivized worker-controlled things is the telephone exchange, which is key for communications back then. And it's controlled by the workers, and the police, the Catalan police, controlled by the Catalan government, which was in the hands of a coalition of Republican Catalan groups and of communists and socialists. The police turns up and says, right, we're taking this over in the name of the government. And so you then get several days of violence in Barcelona, riots and armed clashes between the two sides of the argument. The war side, we should prioritize fighting the war, which is like government forces, the police, the communists as well were on that side, versus the anarchists and the POUM, which was like a semi-Trotskyist revolutionary group, which George Orwell was a member of, who are going, no, it should be revolution. You're eroding the gains that we've made for the workers. And unsurprisingly, the government side wins, and the anarchists really have to kind of retreat with their tails between their legs.
Yeah.
And the POUM are the sad victims of all of this internal political debate, because the Soviet Union at that time was very worried about Trotskyism. Stalin's purges were just kind of kicking off. And the POUM was led by Trotsky's ex-secretary. Now, technically, there had been a break between Trotsky and the POUM, but nevertheless, there was a connection there. And the POUM is basically repressed, is crushed. The leaders are captured and many of them executed. So within Republican politics, there's this fierce debate, and it actually ends, it ends in tears, ends in violence.
Yeah. I mean, it's so, and I don't want to keep saying it's so messy, but I mean, how else do you describe it? And it's hard for us now to go back and try and draw any conclusions, because like I said last episode, it's recent history, and it's impossible to.
There's a lot of debate. Yeah.
There's a lot of debate. I mean, every historian of the Spanish Civil War, I think, has their own opinions.
Yeah, absolutely.
It
is like I said last episode, live history, in terms of you'll get very different perspectives between even modern historians. On that war v revolution argument, for example, do you support the communist and Republican and kind of liberal view of, right, we need to fight the war, central government should be in charge, or do you fight the more romantic kind of anarchist view of, no, it's all about revolution and everyone like that? And historians over ever since have come down often on one side or the other.
Yeah.
So there is so many layers of complexity to this war. I don't think we can do everything justice in this episode, of course, especially as it's kind of an area of my expertise. I mean, I think another area is the kind of violence and terror that's seen on both sides.
Yeah.
But again, I think that probably maybe one day we could talk about that as its own topic, really, because, again, that's really complicated. I mean, why and how violence is undertaken by both sides is another area of real complexity and controversy.
Yeah. I don't know what to say, really. I mean, it's so complex.
It's not many wars, I think, you see this level of, obviously, the causes last episode. I mean, a lot of wars' causes are complex, but it's a real political mess and a political kind of back and forth and social division rising up, really, to be fair, rising up through all the episodes we've done on 20th century Spain.
Oh, yeah.
Problems.
I mean,
divides and hatreds.
Yeah, I mean, there's been, a simmering pot that's been simmering absolutely for the past 100 years in Spain, arguably, for a very, very long time. And
then obviously once you get the war, we've got the complexity of the Republican side complexity on the nationalist side. They're not just these monolithic. I guess because it's not countries at war with each other in a sense.
Yeah.
There's not like, one person in charge, at least, in the Republic. And you also have the international aspect of different countries getting involved for different reasons and all providing different kind of support in different ways as well.
Yeah.
That just mean this is a really kind of difficult war to untangle. I mean, a book written a few years later by someone who'd lived in Spain for a very long time called Gerald Brennan was called The Spanish Labyrinth, trying to explain the war and its causes. And I think that's a good way of putting it. But yeah, I think we because of how much kind of I am passionate about this topic, we can't go into the minutiae of every single aspect.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, hopefully we can do an episode on the International Brigades one day. Hopefully we can do an episode on the terror and the violence of both sides. Hopefully, maybe we could do an episode on, well, if you're interested in the military side, my book is all about that. But I thought, instead of just repeating what's in my book, we could talk about a few other things. But the military side is fascinating and complicated because within the whole war v revolution argument, there's also, should we have a proper, regular, normal army or should we have these revolutionary militias? And the Republican side spends his ages trying to work out which to do and then trying to build a proper army called People's Army, which again I've written a lot about. But yeah, I think probably our listeners are convinced this is a complicated war. And if you want to kind of know more about the outcome of it, like I said, my article that we'll link is about why the Republicans lost the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah. I really the past 4 episodes have been really enlightening. Because
Good.
I mean, because I didn't know a ton about the Spanish Civil War, and again, like you just said, the minutia is still missing. I'm still kind of in my infancy of learning about it, and
well, shall we sign off with one final level of complexity?
Sure.
The war started with a military coup. And it ends with a military coup. Paul Preston's written a fabulous book about it called The Last Days of the Spanish Republic. Once it becomes clear the Republic's about to lose in March 1939, there's a coup by elements of the Republican Army against the Republican government. Because the Prime Minister Caballero got replaced, because he was useless, to be honest, by a guy called Juan Negrin, who had some good, some bad. And he and the Communist Party as well are determined that they're going to fight on because they've tried secret negotiations with Franco. Franco's obviously not up for any kind of negotiated peace. They think their last card they've got to play really is continued resistance. At least then they might be able to organise an evacuation. But factions within the Republic, anarchists, kind of dissident socialists, as well as people, as I said, inside the Republican Army, decide, no, there's no point in carrying this on. And they stage like an anti-communist coup to try and get rid of Negrin, get rid of the Communist Party. And they think, then Franco will do a deal with us because we'll share some common aims and common enemies. So it ends with a mini civil war within the civil war between pro and anti-coup forces. And then the coup does succeed and Negrin flees, and we're left with a regime headed up by a guy called Colonel Casado, who'd led this Republican military coup. But Republican Spain collapses almost instantly when Franco attacks.
Yeah.
So yeah.
One
final level of complexity is there's another coup.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's I've never heard of anything like this. I mean, and the fact that Franco goes on to rule Spain for the rest of his life. He's
the last dictator standing.
Yeah,
in Europe at least. Again, who knows? Maybe one day we'll do something about Franco as well. But
I think we should. I think we should, cover, some of the more minutia that we weren't able to get in with this episode.
Yeah.
I mean, really, we have just barely scratched the surface.
Oh,
with
yeah,
this. I mean,
absolutely.
But
if we've whetted your appetite, then obviously we will, in future episodes, go into some of those. Or perhaps even you could buy a book that's just come out called People's Army in the Spanish Civil War. But yeah, we hope you found it as fascinating as we did.
Yeah.
And I hope personally, as someone who's really interested in this topic, that we might have inspired you to, find out more for yourself as well.
Yeah. That's what we want to do. Is we want to encourage people to look into history. The more the sides that we find fascinating, and the maybe smaller known, the unknowns.
Stuff.
Yeah,
that's what we're all about.
Right.
Great.
Well, what's our next episode going to be about?
Well, we're going to do a mini kind of addendum to this 20th Century Spain series, because there's one man who isn't in the scope of our mini series, who I feel definitely is deserving of an episode of History's Most. I think we're going to call it History's Most Democratic Fascist.
Ooh, interesting.
I think we will save that for next episode, who that is.
Indeed. Take your guesses. Perhaps send in some emails to, who do you think could be? And just send in any emails in general if you want. Give us some suggestions for episodes. Give us some comments, some criticisms. Tell us what you thought about the series on Spain. And
whether we should do more like mini-series like that in the future.
We'd love to hear it.
So yeah, it's histories.most@gmail.com.
Yep.
Is that right?
Histories.most@gmail.com. And we're also on Twitter, @HistoriesMost.
HistoriesMost, yeah.
We forgot to mention that last episode, I think. Whoops, we got to plug it. Oh well.
Fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed that, and I hope.
Yeah, I
listened to one or two things.
I hope so too. Well, from us at History's Most, this has been History's Most Complicated War, and we hope you enjoyed. I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex. Have a great day.